Okay, let's jump right in then. Picture this. You're deep, really deep, in the Amazon rainforest, part of an expedition.
Yeah, and you're there looking for specific psychoactive plants, maybe ayahuasca, something known.
Right. But then maybe it's chance, maybe something else. Things take a turn.
They do. Instead of what they expected, two young brothers on this trip, they stumble across this mushroom, Stropharia cubensis.
The kind you might find in, like, a cow pasture.
Yeah.
Not exactly deep jungle exotic.
Not at all. And the experience they had, well, it wasn't just, seeing some patterns. They called it a shattering discontinuity.
That's a strong phrase. What do they mean by that?
It sounds like it completely broke their normal sense of reality. Time, perception, everything. It felt so profound, so reality bending that it basically forced them to try and rewrite their entire understanding of the universe.
Wow. Okay, so that experience, that really personal kind of strange event, that's the starting point for our deep dive today.
That's exactly it. We're going into the world of ideas they explored in their book, The Invisible Landscape, Terence and Dennis McKenna.
And our source is the book itself, specifically key bits from it. It's known for being, well, a challenging read sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Dense, definitely technical in places, but also really fascinating. And they even called it marvelously weird themselves. No apologies.
So our mission, for you listening, is to kind of guide you through their first big attempt to make sense of this flood of ideas they got.
Right. They were young, grappling with something huge, trying to use Western science, philosophy, mythology, whatever tools they had, to understand something that felt totally outside normal experience.
And we should probably acknowledge up front, some parts might sound a bit naive now, maybe even a little unhinged.
For sure. But we want to focus on the core intuition driving it all. What was that initial spark?
So that mushroom experience itself, how did they describe the feeling of it?
They said it was mainly about understanding, like pure information download, an amplified appearance of reality.
Amplified appearance, and what does that mean? Like seeing more clearly?
Kind of, but maybe deeper. They speculated it might somehow relate to their own DNA or tapping into some kind of a temporal unconscious.
An unconscious outside of time.
Yeah, or like a standing wave of species experience. Big ideas right from the start.
It's definitely big ideas. So you have this overwhelming experience, feels like pure information. How do you even begin to process that?
Well, Dennis McKenna, with his science background, his first instinct was neurobiology. How is this happening in the brain, physically?
Makes sense. Look for the mechanism.
Right. But they pretty quickly felt that classical science, the standard materialist view, just wasn't enough.
Why not? What was missing?
Well, science back then, and largely still, tends to focus on measurable material stuff. It sort of inherited this idea of a rational, knowable order.
From older traditions, philosophy, that kind of thing?
Exactly. But its insistence on reducing everything to basic observable facts, often by deliberately leaving out tricky things like mind or purpose, well, it created a kind of paradox.
The paradox being?
You end up with this picture of a universe that's fundamentally lifeless, just particles bumping around according to laws, purposeless.
But here we are, living, thinking, seeing patterns everywhere.
Precisely. How does a purposeless, lifeless system produce us? And consciousness, and all this apparent order and meaning, it felt like a huge disconnect.
So they needed a different starting point.
Yeah. They looked towards quantum physics, which was already showing that reality at the bottom isn't solid things. It's more like dynamic processes or events.
That's a fundamental shift. Not objects, but actions.
And that shift, that's key, because it opens up the possibility that organism, life, even mind, aren't just weird late-stage accidents. Maybe they're fundamental aspects of reality itself.
That really flips the script. And you mentioned a Whitehead quote they used.
Yeah, the idea that an electron inside a body runs according to the body's plan, and that plan includes the mental state. It puts mind right back into the fabric of reality, not just floating on top.
Okay, so if mind isn't just an add-on, how might it be organized? This is where the holography comes in.
Exactly. They proposed the holographic theory as a model for brain and mind organization. You know how a hologram works, right?
Sort of. 3D image, laser beams. Something about the whole picture being in every part.
That's the crucial bit. Lensless photography creates a 3D image, and if you break the holographic plate, each little piece can still reconstruct the entire image. Maybe fuzzier, but still the whole thing.
Okay, got it. So how does that relate to the brain and memory?
Well, think about memory. It's always been a puzzle. We have a fixed number of neurons, roughly. They don't really regenerate much. Yet we store vast amounts of information over a lifetime. Where is it all kept?
Good question. Not like neat little files on a hard drive, presumably.
Doesn't seem like it. Classic experiments like Carl Lashley's work back in the day, he removed different bits of rats' brains.
And the memories weren't just gone.
No, specific memories weren't localized. Removing parts seemed to degrade the overall performance, but didn't just delete one specific learned task. It suggested the memory was somehow smeared out, distributed.
Like a hologram.
Exactly. And then Peach did those even stranger experiments with salamanders, scrambling parts of their brains and finding the information the learned behaviors could still be recovered. It really points towards memory behaving holographically.
So what was their specific hypothesis? Where are these neural holograms stored?
They proposed it happens at the synaptic junctions, those tiny gaps between neurons. Complex changes in the macromolecules there could store interference patterns, essentially holograms.
And the brain regions we see light up in scans.
They might be acting like the reconstruction beams, the lasers, reading out and processing this distributed holographic information. Think about associative memory, how one thought triggers another seemingly unrelated one. That feels very holographic. One part resonates with the whole.
Okay, that's a fascinating model for the brain. But they didn't stop there, did they?
No, this is where they took a really big leap. What if this holographic principle isn't just for brains? What if it's fundamental to nature, right down to the quantum level?
Whoa. Like each particle contains the whole universe.
Sort of. They talked about a holographic monad, each quantum unit potentially holding information about the whole system.
And this connects to physics, like relativity.
Potentially, yeah. They speculated that maybe space-time isn't the container, but exists within each quantum unit. And this vast holographic matrix of potentiality could mean that, somehow, all times are simultaneously present or accessible at some fundamental level.
That is seriously mind-bending stuff. Oh, okay, let's bring it back to the drugs, the mushrooms. How do they fit into this picture?
They saw these compounds, tryptamines like psilocybin or DMT, beta-carbolines like harmine found in ayahuasca, not just as things that mess with your brain chemicals temporarily, as sophisticated molecular probes, keys almost.
Yeah.
Keys that could unlock access to these deeper, maybe holographic layers of reality.
Why was the proposed mechanism?
Their hypothesis was really specific and pretty radical. They suggested these molecules don't just bind to receptors on the surface of neurons. They propose they actually intercalate.
Intercalate, like slot themselves in.
Exactly. Slot themselves directly into the structure of neural nucleic acids, RNA, and even DNA.
Inside the cell nucleus. That's a big claim.
Huge. And then they went further. They speculated that this complex, the drug molecule slotted into the nucleic acid, could generate a specific kind of signal, a modulated electron spin resonance, or ESR signal.
ESR, that's a real physical measurement technique.
Yes, used in chemistry and physics. Their idea was that this specific ESR signal, generated by these drug nucleic acid complexes, might actually be the physical basis of thought, of consciousness itself.
Wait, so normal consciousness is one kind of ESR signal and psychedelic consciousness is another?
That was the speculation. Maybe serotonin, the everyday neurotransmitter, generates the standard signal of waking consciousness, but something like harmine, a beta-carboline, intercalating, might produce a signal with, quote, more information, an adaptive advance.
Or bandwidth, maybe.
Kind of. And this shift, potentially happening in neural tissue, may be linked to the pineal gland, which makes DMT. They thought this could be the actual molecular event behind the evolution of consciousness, these feelings of expanded awareness, what they called intimations of transfiguration.
So consciousness as a specific type of magnetic resonance signal enhanced by these molecules interacting directly with our genetic material. That is...
Wow. It led them to this concept of a hollow cybernetic unit. Picture a kind of biological computer system.
Okay.
Where DNA is the massive hard drive, the information bank. Harmine, the beta-carboline, is like the readout head accessing the data, and a tryptamine, like DMT or psilocybin, acts as the switch, maybe triggered mentally, and possibly even as an antenna receiving external information.
A superconducting genetic system.
Yeah.
Accessing potentially all information.
That was the implication. If such a system exists, it could potentially make all personal genetic memory, maybe even collective evolutionary information, directly accessible to consciousness. It ties back to the hologram idea, the whole is in the part.
What is here is everywhere. What is not here is nowhere.
That's the quote they used, capturing that sense of universal access.
Right. So they've built this elaborate model involving holography, quantum physics, molecular biology, trying to explain the nature of the information they felt they accessed. But you said the experience also revealed something about time.
Yes, that was the other major pillar. They described how the subjective feeling of the mushroom experience seemed to spontaneously organize itself or constellate around the I Ching.
The ancient Chinese book of changes. The hexagrams.
Exactly. They even reported feeling guided by an entity they perceived during the trip, something they described as an insectoid intelligence.
Insectoid intelligence. Okay.
And this entity, they felt, specifically pointed them towards the King Wen sequence of the I Ching's 64 hexagrams, suggesting that sequence held a vital key to understanding time itself.
So not just a divination tool for telling fortunes.
No, they saw it much more deeply, as reflecting a kind of Neolithic intuition about the fundamental structure of time, psychic time, and the dynamics of how things change. They were fascinated by the patterns, the idea of backward-moving numbers in the sequence, and whether understanding it could allow for calculating future events.
And they found a pattern in that sequence.
They did. Through really intensive analysis, they proposed they'd uncovered a hidden structure within the King Wen sequence, a structure that was fractal, hierarchical, and modular.
Fractal-like.
Yeah.
Self-similar patterns repeating at different scales.
Precisely. And here's the radical step. They didn't just say, oh, neat pattern. They proposed this fractal pattern was a model for the structure of time itself. They called it the wave of time.
A wave. Implying cycles and flow.
Yes. They noted periodicities within the structure that seemed to resonate with historical cycles, like a 384-day cycle they connected to an ancient Chinese lunar year. And the whole structure, they calculated, needed 26 levels of this fractal hierarchy to reach completion.
26 levels. This sounds complex. How did they visualize it?
This led directly to their famous time wave zero concept, and they actually wrote software to map it out. The software generates these graphs, these novelty maps.
Novelty maps, what do they show?
They're supposed to chart the ebb and flow of novelty versus habit throughout history. When the wave on the graph goes steeply down, it indicates increasing novelty, new connections, complexity, change accelerating.
And when it goes up?
That indicates decreasing novelty, periods of consolidation, habit, things becoming more predictable or stable.
Okay, but how do you link this abstract mathematical wave to actual history?
That was the key step. They had to tune the wave. They took major historical turning points, the fall of empires, births of religions, scientific revolutions, and tried to fit the ups and downs of the wave to these events.
So they matched the pattern to known history.
Yes, it was an empirical fitting process. And through that process, trying different endpoints for the wave's completion, they landed on a specific date where the wave structure mathematically reached its end, its 0 point.
The point of maximum novelty.
Exactly. Infinite novelty, theoretically. And the date they arrived at through this mathematical fitting was December 21st, 2012.
Which is famous for another reason.
Right. The Mayan calendar end date. And what's really striking and fuels a lot of the fascination is they claimed they derived this date from the I Ching mathematics before they were widely aware of the Mayan connection. That convergence seemed significant to them.
That is quite a coincidence, if it is one. Did the wave fit history well, according to them?
They argued it did. They showed examples like, say, the period from the fall of Rome up to the European Enlightenment corresponding to a long, steep descent into novelty. The last 1,500 years especially looked incredibly novel on their graph.
And because it's fractal.
Right. The same patterns repeat on smaller scales. So the dynamics of centuries might be mirrored in decades or years or even days, just compressed, cycles within cycles, accelerating.
So this wave isn't just tracking the past, it's pointing towards a future, towards that end date.
Yes, it depicts time as a process with a direction, moving towards something specific. This endpoint, the 0 point of the wave, they called the eschaton, or the omega point.
Like Teilhard de Chardin's idea.
Similar concept, yeah. A terminal point of transformation, the point where the wave theoretically reaches infinite novelty, zero habit. In their terms, it corresponds to realized concrescent satisfaction.
Concrescent satisfaction. What does that mean?
It sounds like a state of ultimate integration, maybe energy or being completely unbound by the normal rules of space and time.
And this is where things get really wild, isn't it? The acceleration.
Oh, yeah. This is where they described concrescence most dramatically. As the wave gets closer and closer to that 0 point, time itself, according to the fractal pattern, seems to compress or accelerate exponentially.
How dramatically?
They made the absolutely staggering claim that Based on the wave scaling, something like half of the entire universe is becoming maybe 36 billion years worth could effectively happen in the final 384 days leading up to the eschaton.
Wait, half of cosmic history in just over a year.
Or even, as they push it further, potentially compressed into the final minutes or seconds. It completely breaks conventional thinking about linear time.
That's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Billions of years folding into a moment.
It pushes imagination to its absolute limit. And they tried to connect this seemingly bizarre idea back to wider cosmology.
How so?
They saw potential alignment with very speculative physics models, like Edward Trion's idea of the universe emerging from a quantum fluctuation, a universe that might be balanced, overall zero energy, maybe with equal parts matter and antimatter.
A universe and an anti-universe.
Potentially. In that kind of picture, the concrescence isn't a big bang or a big crunch happening in space. It's more like the universe and its hypothetical opposite meeting and canceling out or resolving simultaneously across the entire structure of reality.
A cessation of physical laws as we know them.
That's how they put it, a complete phase transition. They even pointed to echoes of this in old myths, like the Mandaean idea of a person having a sort of light double or counterpart.
So, bringing it back to us, to life and consciousness, where do we fit in this picture?
In this framework, life and especially self-reflecting consciousness like ours aren't just random flukes. They're seen as emergent properties deeply tied to this temporal flow of the universe, particularly as it accelerates towards this point of concrescence.
So our existence means something in this cosmic process.
It suggests so. And the original Amazon experiment, that intense mushroom experience, gets reframed. It wasn't just a personal psychological event. Maybe it was somehow tapping into the imminence of this massive universe-wide transformation, feeling the acceleration, perhaps.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's try and pull these threads together.
Absolutely. You start with this incredibly intense personal psychedelic experience. That becomes the catalyst.
Right, the spark.
Which then leads them on the sprawling intellectual journey, exploring speculative molecular biology, trying to find a mechanism.
Diving into ancient Chinese wisdom, the I Ching, finding patterns in time.
Connecting it to modern physics, holography, quantum ideas, even grand cosmological models.
It's an incredible synthesis, isn't it? Attempting to build this single coherent framework around that initial subjective event.
It really is, and it presents a fundamentally different way of looking at reality, at time, at our place in the cosmos. It's radically non-mainstream, as they knew.
Yeah, it definitely challenges conventional science, conventional history.
Hugely. It suggests that maybe profound insights aren't only found through telescopes and particle accelerators. Maybe subjective experience, maybe ancient systems like the I Ching hold valid information too.
Which brings us back to shamanism and psychedelics. They saw those as ways to access this deeper layer.
Potentially, yes. Controlled ways, sometimes uncontrolled maybe, of tapping into that underlying reality, that standing wave of species experience, or even feeling the pull of this accelerating time wave.
And it puts things like purpose back into the picture, teleology. The idea that nature isn't just random drift.
Right, maybe there's an inherent drive towards complexity, towards concrescence, maybe counteracting entropy in some way. It forces a rethink of mind, matter, and whether there's an underlying goal or direction.
But what about free will? If the time wave points to a fixed end date, this eschaton, are we just passengers on a predetermined ride?
That's a really tricky point they grappled with. They seem to suggest that while the final moment, the concrescence, might be a fixed point in this temporal structure, an imposed fact.
We still have a role to play?
Maybe. Perhaps humanity, with our unique self-awareness, our consciousness, can actually anticipate this transformation, especially during periods of high novelty when the fractal compression makes the future feel closer, more accessible.
So the human mind becomes like the leading edge, the universe becoming aware of its own process through us.
That seems to be the implication, that we're not just passive observers, but potentially active participants in this unfolding cosmic drama.
It's important to remember, as you said, they didn't claim this is the absolute final truth.
No, definitely not. Dennis McKenna, looking back later, called it a first faltering step. An initial attempt to build a bigger picture that could actually include experiences like theirs, experiences that standard science often dismisses.
So reflecting on this whole deep dive, it's been quite a journey. From a mushroom in the Amazon,
to speculative molecular biology in the brain,
to ancient Chinese patterns mapping time,
to fractal time waves, and the potential endpoint of the entire universe, it's an extraordinary scope of ideas.
Undeniably speculative,
Mhm.
absolutely born from a unique personal experience.
For sure. But the way they weave together science, philosophy, mysticism, it's genuinely unique. You don't see that kind of synthesis often.
They certainly weren't afraid to ask the biggest questions, even if the answers sounded wild.
No fear there at all.
Nah,
Which leaves us, and you listening, with some pretty big things to chew on, doesn't it?
it really does. Like, what does it truly mean if maybe, just maybe, profound insights about reality can come from subjective states or from studying ancient, seemingly esoteric patterns?
And what if time isn't just the tick-tock of a clock? What if it has a shape, a structure, a direction, actively pulling us towards some kind of unimaginable transformation?
Yeah. And building on that idea of concrescence, just consider the possibility.
Yeah.
What if our everyday reality, the one that feels so solid and predictable,
What if underneath it's actually accelerating, racing towards a point where the veil we perceive between the ordinary and the deeply mysterious just dissolves entirely?
a state where maybe everything becomes possible? It's definitely something to mull over.